Just off the Antarctic coast, this is a U.S. Navy seaplane gliding into a snowstorm. On board are 9 individuals engaged in a clandestine operation to seize Antarctica for the United States. The crew loses all visibility as they approach land, and the storm grows increasingly worse. Then, all of a sudden, bang! The jet crashes into the snow after colliding with a mountain. The crew was left abandoned and severely injured in the most hostile terrain on Earth after the most distant plane accident ever. Although the conditions were extremely harsh, 6 crew members made it through the ordeal and were eventually rescued after 13 days. We modeled everything to demonstrate the heroic rescue mission that saved this brave group of humans and their survival strategy. After World War II ended in 1945, the United States began to focus on Antarctica. It appeared as though the next war would be fought for ownership of this enormous, unclaimed tract of land, which had unrealized potential. In December 1946, the United States dispatched a massive expedition to Antarctica consisting of 13 ships, 33 planes, and 5,000 troops on a clandestine mission to explore the continent, establish outposts, and ultimately claim it for themselves. 2 pilots, a radio man, a machinist, a navigator, a photographer, and the captain made up the 9-man crew of the George I, which was one of the first aircraft to take off. Due to the exceptionally cold weather and the arduous flight, the plane was unable to climb over 300 meters. The team finally made it to the coast after 3 hours, but visibility was at an all-time low and the weather was worse than before. The dense ice layer below was causing the plane's altimeter to malfunction, indicating that the crew remained 300 meters above ground level. The ground was really rising rapidly beneath them, but they had no idea. The pilot, Frenchie, gave the order to turn back and abandon the operation. Unfortunately, the plane ripped a huge hole in the hull as it careened into a mountain, preventing him from accomplishing this. 5,000 liters of fuel caught fire instantly, leading to a massive explosion in midair. The jet plummeted to the ice, releasing its crew and a trail of wreckage. In a word, it was a catastrophe. Tragically, Henderson and Lopez perished instantly upon impact with the propellers of the aircraft. Frenchie was severely burned and hardly able to walk, but the remainder of the crew was still alive. Even worse was Fred Williams, who had many facial injuries and a broken back. It appeared highly probable that he would perish. As soon as their instincts took over, the crew made haste to seek refuge in the jet's torn-apart tunnel portion. In order to block the wind and snow from entering the tunnel, they discovered a parachute and fastened it to its end. They dug through the rubble and discovered tents, sleeping bags, and food supplies, mostly in the form of tinned meat and soup. The team took refuge in their shelter throughout the storm because they had no idea when or if anyone would come looking for them. Since Williams's injuries prevented him from being transported, the crew constructed a makeshift shelter surrounding him with a sleeping bag and several huge pieces of rubble. Williams had already fallen asleep due to the chilly Antarctic weather when Robbins went out to see how he was doing a few hours later. There were now only 6 crew members left, and their only chance of survival was to be located. It would be very difficult to locate their debris, especially since their supply ship, Pine Island, was 500 kilometers away. The Pine Island crew returned to the ship and immediately set out to organize a rescue operation. They thought the crew was about here based on the last information they had, but they don't know when the jet went down, so they could have been anywhere. Thankfully, the data was in their possession and hadn't gotten into the wrong hands. Those on Pine Island had a mission: locate the George I crew and save their lives using an aircraft that could only land on water. No rescue missions could be conducted because the weather around the ship stayed severe for another 3 days. The 6 survivors were shivering to death in the -20-degree blizzard that had enveloped the accident site. Frenchie was in a terrible state, and he could not open his mouth due to his burns. Frostbite and dehydration were killing him one by one, but the lack of bacteria in the cold, dry weather had prevented illnesses that would have killed him by now. But Frenchie never once grumbled, and, wherever possible, sought to lighten the mood with a joke. As Robbins continued to rummage among the wreckage, he eventually located a gas stove and was able to use fuel from an extra tank on the plane to light it. After that, he took over as the crew's de facto chef, preparing their 2 daily meals, spinach soup and peanut butter on bread. The clouds parted on day 4, and the sun began to shine down on them in a torrential downpour. Regardless of the circumstances, the breathtaking beauty of the place utterly captivated them. During this little respite in the weather, They laid their fallen crew members to rest in the snow. Inside the graves, they hid metal devices that might be detected by magnetometers, making it easier for recovery personnel to locate them. By day 5, the crash site crew's supply of fresh food had depleted to the point where they would soon have to rely on cans of dry meat. Robbins discovered a camera that belonged to the photographer Lopez, who tragically lost his life in the crash that day while searching for additional equipment. So that he wouldn't forget, he snapped a few photos of the crash scene and stashed the film in his sleeping bag. After 7 days in severe weather, a rescue plane took off from Pine Island in pursuit of the ship's crew. Based on the most recent confirmed plane location, the rescue crew began a ladder search pattern of ground scanning. By the time they got to land, the sky had gotten so gloomy that they couldn't see the crew through the dense fog. Right now, Frenchie awoke in a haze and claimed to have heard a distant jet. There had been no word to him. Just fantasizing about being rescued was all he was doing. The plane had actually gone within 20 kilometers of the crew, though. The next several days saw the return of the inclement weather, and morale plummeted to an all-time low. In a last-ditch effort to attract the notice of any passing plane, the crew built a massive pile of rubble that might be easily ignited. In addition to the bright paint, Robbins stashed a note on the wing for their rescuers to find. Time was of the essence for the team, but their fortunes were about to turn. The group was enjoying breakfast, a few slices of apricots, on the morning of day 13, when the wonderful weather finally returned. Suddenly, a faint tremor began to shake the earth, and as it grew stronger, the Pine Island crew eventually located their missing comrades. Clutching their arms above, the survivors dashed off into the distance. As much as they wished it would, the plane couldn't land safely or even use its landing gear. Thus, their ordeal was ultimately terminated. "If you can walk to the lake 10 miles north, join hands and form a circle," they wrote on a note and sent it down to the crew. "Make a straight line if that is not possible." Without delay, they gathered into a circle and started fastening Frenchie to a sled in preparation for their most challenging expedition to date. Their plane had shrunk to the size of a dot on the landscape, and they counted themselves extremely lucky to have been located. After nearly 12 hours of dragging Frenchie through snow up to their chests, they finally reached the lake. The rescue plane kept close behind them for the most part, taking pictures and dropping supplies every so often to indicate their path. 2 guys set out to search for survivors after the jet made a flawless landing on the lake. However, out of nowhere, a dense fog bank came rolling in, rendering both parties totally oblivious. As they drew nearer, the survivors could make out the faraway rumble of an aircraft. However, right as they believed they had reached the lake, they saw a cliff that was 20 meters high, the last obstacle standing in their way. Surprisingly, a seemingly predetermined route to the left guided the way, as if it had been positioned there to save the team. Carefully descending onto the ice shelf, 2 men emerged from the fog. Their reunion with the crew came after 2 weeks of unimaginable anguish and suffering. All 6 men returned to the ship safely after boarding the rescue plane. The 6 guys continued to recount the story, which was among the most incredible accounts of courage and survival. All the while, the 3 men who went missing were buried alive and well beneath the 80 years' worth of snow and ice, which had accumulated to a depth of more than 100 meters. Even after Robbins discovered it, the camera remained at the crash site. Pictures are worth 1,000 words, and this one is just sitting there, waiting to be found. Tragically, no one has ever returned to the legendary site, and no one has ever found the 3 guys.